If you grew up in America during the 1950s or 60s, you probably remember a time when hobbies weren't always ready to go right out of the box. Sometimes you had to build them, sometimes you had to fix them, and sometimes you found out what you'd done wrong only after the engine refused to start, the car jumped the track, or you went sailing off onto the pavement. Some of those hobbies are nearly gone now. Others are still around, but they're not quite the same for the people who grew up with them. Though, they became part of childhood itself, the smell of gasoline in the garage, a comic book folded into a back pocket, a model rocket disappearing into the sky, while everybody stood there hoping the parachute would open. Those memories stick with you, so let's go back for a few minutes. These are 10 hobbies from an earlier America that are hard to imagine quite the same way today. 1. Mini bikes. If you were a kid in the late 1960s or early 70s, a mini bike could look like the greatest machine ever invented. Department store catalogs carried little gasoline-powered bikes that looked like someone had taken a motorcycle and shrunk it down just enough for a kid to believe he could handle it. A Sears mini bike might cost close to $190, and back then, that was real money. Most kids weren't simply pointing at a catalog page and having one show up at the house a few days later. Some saved money from a paper route. Some mowed lawns. Some picked berries, shoveled snow, washed cars, or took whatever odd jobs the neighborhood offered. And plenty of kids did it the harder way. They found an old lawnmower engine or chainsaw motor, got their hands on a frame, and started figuring things out. The finished product might not have won any beauty contests. The paint could have come from a spray can. The brakes might have been a little optimistic. And getting that engine to run could eat up an entire Saturday afternoon. But once it finally fired, that bike was yours. Kids rode them through empty lots, dirt trails, fields, and half-built developments, the kind of places that used to sit at the edge of American neighborhoods before another row of houses or shopping centers went up. For a lot of boys, that little machine started something that never really went away. A lifelong love of engines, motorcycles, mechanical work, speed. And more than 50 years later, mention the subject, and many of them can still tell you exactly what they had. Rupp, Bonanza, Sears, Honda Mini Trail. Ask about that old bike, and suddenly they're 16 years old again. They can still hear the engine. 2. Slot car racing. For a few years in the 1960s, slot car racing was everywhere. Commercial tracks opened across the country, some with enormous multi-lane layouts that seemed to fill an entire room. You'd walk in carrying your little electric car, put it on the track, grab the controller, and spend the next couple of hours trying to get just a little faster. But anybody who was really into slot cars knew the racing was only half the hobby. You changed the tires, adjusted the gears, worked on the motor, picked a body, painted it, changed something else. Then you put the car back on the track and found out whether you were a genius or whether you had just made it slower. That was part of the fun. The big commercial slot car boom didn't last very long. By the end of the 1960s, many of those racing centers were disappearing, but the hobby never completely went away. It moved into basements, garages, bedrooms, local hobby shops, home tracks built on sheets of plywood, and some of the kids who raced slot cars back then never really stopped. They're still doing it today. That may be the best way to remember slot cars. They weren't simply another fad that came and went. They became quieter, more private, a little more personal, but for the people who loved them, the race kept going. 3. The comic book rack. Before comic book stores became destinations of their own, comics were just part of the neighborhood. You saw them in drugstores, newsstands, PX stores, five and dimes, tobacco shops. And if you were lucky, there was a spinner rack sitting somewhere near the front. For 10 or 12 cents, you could walk in, turn that rack around a few times, make your choice, and walk out with an entire world under your arm. Everybody remembers different titles: Sergeant Rock, Sad Sack, Mad, Donald Duck, Uncle Scrooge, Turok, Superman, Batman. There were war stories, westerns, monsters, humor, superheroes, something for just about every kid. And nobody treated those comics like museum pieces. You read them, traded them, rolled them up, stuffed them into a back pocket, passed them to your brother, swapped 3 of yours for 2 of somebody else's. Some were read so many times, the covers practically came off. Parents didn't always approve. Teachers certainly didn't always approve. And that probably made kids like them even more. Comic books felt like something that belonged to you. A little world the adults weren't completely in charge of. Today, collectors may handle an old comic with gloves and carefully slide it into a protective sleeve. Back then, a kid might fold it in half, carry it around all day, and trade it the next afternoon. Its cash value might have been almost nothing. Its memory value turned out to be something else entirely. 4. Homemade go-karts. Some hobbies started in stores. Go-karts often started in the garage. You looked around and gathered whatever you could find. An old lawnmower engine, a frame made of wood or steel, a seat, 4 wheels, some kind of steering system, and hopefully brakes that worked when you needed them. By the late 1950s and early 60s, organized kart racing was spreading across America, but for plenty of kids, the first go-kart they ever saw wasn't at a racetrack. It was down the street. Somebody's father, older brother, uncle, or some kid who was unusually good with tools had figured out how to bolt an engine onto something with 4 wheels, and the minute the neighborhood saw it, everybody wanted one. The great thing about building a go-kart was that the machine taught you whether you knew what you were doing. A loose chain came off. Poor steering announced itself immediately. An engine that wouldn't start forced you to figure out why, and if the kid down the block had a faster kart than yours, you went home, opened the garage door, and started looking for an answer. Maybe it was the gearing, maybe the engine, maybe the weight. Whatever it was, you wanted to know. Winning was fun, but for a lot of kids, the real hobby wasn't driving the go-kart, it was making the thing work. 5. Model rockets. It's hard to explain to younger generations just how much the space age captured America's imagination. During the late 1950s and throughout the 60s, rockets were everywhere. Sputnik, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, astronauts were household names. Schools talked about space. Television talked about space. Magazines talked about space. And then came July 1969. Men were walking on the moon. So naturally, American kids wanted rockets of their own. In the early years, some young experimenters tried building homemade rockets in ways that, looking back, were more than a little frightening. Fortunately, commercially manufactured model rocket engines and organized safety standards helped turn that fascination into a much safer hobby. Companies like Estes put rocket kits into the hands of an entire generation, and the ritual was part of the experience. You built the body, glued on the fins, waited for everything to dry, painted it, packed the parachute, checked it again. Then you carried your rocket out to an open field, set it on the launch pad, and hoped you had done everything right. The countdown lasted only a few seconds, but you might have spent days getting ready for it. Then came ignition. That little rocket shot into the air, climbing higher than something you built at the kitchen table had any business going, and everybody watched. You waited for the parachute. There it was, and as soon as the rocket touched the ground, you wanted to do the whole thing again. For kids growing up during the space race, a model rocket wasn't just another toy. It felt like a small piece of the future. 6. Hunting for silver coins. Not every childhood hobby involved an engine, a track, or a trip to the hobby shop. Sometimes all you needed was a roll of coins and a kitchen table. When the United States began removing most silver from circulating dimes and quarters in the mid-1960s, older coins suddenly became something people paid attention to. Kids noticed too. You checked pocket change, cash registers, bank rolls, coins your parents brought home, a dime dated 1964 or earlier. That deserved another look. The routine couldn't have been simpler. Open the roll, check the dates, look at the mint marks, keep anything interesting, return the rest, then start over. It turned ordinary pocket change into a treasure hunt. And without anybody planning it, kids learned a few things along the way. Dates mattered, condition mattered, rarity mattered, tiny differences mattered, A coffee can full of old coins sitting on a shelf might have looked like nothing more than loose change. Then 30, 40, or 50 years passed. Someone cleaned out an attic, opened that can, and realized Grandpa or Dad knew exactly what he was putting away. 7. Tether Cars. Of everything on this list, tether cars may be the hobby that feels most like it came from another world. These were small gasoline-powered race cars attached to a central post by a cable. There was no driver, no steering once the run started. The builder prepared the car, tuned the engine, started it, released it, and got out of the way. Then the little machine tore around the circular track at remarkable speeds. But here's what made tether car racing interesting. Most of the real competition happened before the car ever moved. You worked on the engine, the fuel mixture, the tires, the weight, the aerodynamics, the balance. Every small change mattered. And once that car was released, there was nothing left to do. You stood there and watched. Either your hours in the garage had paid off, or they hadn't. Tether car racing was always more specialized than something like bicycles or comic books. But look at old photographs of those cars and tracks, and you see something very American about mid-century hobby culture. People were building surprisingly sophisticated machines in garages and workshops for one simple reason. They wanted to see how fast they could make them go. Sometimes that was reason enough. 8. Home movies on 8mm and Super 8. Today, most of us can record an hour of video without giving it a second thought. A family in the 1960s couldn't do that. Film cost money, processing cost money, and every cartridge gave you only a few precious minutes. That meant you didn't film everything. You chose what mattered: birthdays, Christmas morning, a vacation, a wedding, a child learning to ride a bicycle, grandparents standing in the yard, maybe somebody turning toward the camera and waving for 3 seconds, never imagining that their grandchildren might still be watching that exact moment 60 years later. Afterward, the film was sent away for processing. Then you waited. A few days later, or sometimes longer, it came back. That was when the family gathered. Someone pulled out the projector. A screen came down. Or maybe there was no screen, so somebody hung a white sheet on the wall. The lights went off. The projector started clicking. And there was your family, moving again. For many people, those little reels eventually became the only moving pictures they had of parents, grandparents, relatives, childhood homes, and neighborhoods that no longer exist. The cameras disappeared from everyday life. The projectors ended up in closets and attics. But millions of those reels are still out there. Small boxes filled with a few minutes of someone's life, waiting for somebody to turn the lights off and watch them again. 9. The first skateboards. Long before skateboards became sophisticated sporting equipment, some of the earliest ones were barely more than homemade experiments. Take a piece of wood, find an old pair of roller skates, separate the wheels, attach them underneath, and there you had it. Or at least, you hoped you did. Commercial skateboarding took off during the 1960s, but those early boards had one major weakness: the wheels. Many were made with hard clay wheels that had almost no forgiveness on rough pavement, and anyone who rode one remembers the problem. You could be moving along just fine, then hit a pebble, the skateboard stopped, you didn't. Not surprisingly, injuries followed. Cities started paying attention, parents got nervous. And that first skateboard boom collapsed almost as fast as it had arrived, and for a while it looked as though skateboarding might simply disappear. Then in the 1970s, urethane wheels changed everything. The ride became smoother, grip improved, control improved. Suddenly the skateboard felt like a completely different machine. A hobby that had nearly died came roaring back, and eventually, it became a worldwide culture, an industry, and even an Olympic sport. All because someone improved the part that kept failing. There may be a lesson in that. 10. Model airplanes. Long before drones and remote control toys were everywhere, building model airplanes was a serious childhood hobby. Kids bought inexpensive kits from hobby shops, carefully glued together wooden frames, stretched tissue over the wings, painted the finished plane, and sometimes spent days getting everything just right. Some models were simple gliders. Others used rubber band motors. And the more ambitious kids moved on to gas-powered control line planes. Building one required patience, because a crooked wing, or too much weight, could ruin the flight. And when the airplane finally left your hand and stayed in the air, even for a few seconds, it felt like all that work had paid off. For many kids, the real fun wasn't just flying the airplane. It was building something at the kitchen table, carrying it outside, and discovering whether it would actually fly. If you grew up during those years, which one of these did you have? And what hobby did we leave off the list? Tell us your story in the comments, because sometimes the best history isn't sitting in a textbook, it's carried by the people who were there.